Serena Robinson sat motionless, her cheek burning from the sharp slap Captain Matthews had just delivered. A stunned silence gripped the first-class cabin. Passengers frozen in disbelief, eyes darting between the furious pilot and the composed billionaire. But Serena, she didn't flinch. Slowly, she turned her head back, locking eyes with the man who had just assaulted her. A slow, knowing smirk played on her lips. Big mistake. 2 minutes later, the entire plane was thrown into chaos. Phones rang, security scrambled, news outlets were alerted. Matthews and the flight attendant had no idea who they had just messed with, but they were about to find out. The ruthless revenge was just beginning. But before we dive into this unbelievable story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next jaw-dropping tale. Serena Robinson stepped onto the Concorde airliner flight from Los Angeles to New York, the bustling airport terminal fading behind her as she walked toward the first-class cabin. It had been a long day filled with back-to-back meetings and a groundbreaking business deal in the healthcare sector, one that had taken months of careful planning and strategy. Now, finally, she was heading home. The weight of her work felt heavy on her shoulders, but Serena didn't mind. She was used to the pressure. As a 42-year-old black entrepreneur, Serena had built a successful tech company focused on developing innovative healthcare solutions for underserved communities, and this new deal was poised to impact thousands of lives around the world. Serena had always believed that success was not about flaunting wealth or seeking the spotlight. It was about doing work that mattered. The quiet yet powerful impact of her company's work was enough. And as she boarded the plane, she longed for a moment of peace, away from the demands of work, away from the expectations of others. First class would be her sanctuary for the next few hours, where she could relax and unwind in comfort. Little did she know, this moment of peace would soon be shattered. Serena was the epitome of understated elegance. She wore a simple light gray coat and black slacks, carrying a modest handbag. Her attire was far from extravagant, as she had never been one to adorn herself with flashy labels or jewelry. She was not one to call attention to herself. She was content to let her work speak for her. The gold ring on her finger, a simple yet meaningful gift from her mother, was the only visible hint of the success she had achieved. To her, it symbolized the values her family had instilled in her: hard work, perseverance, and compassion. Her story was one of resilience, a journey shaped by the challenges she had overcome throughout her life. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Serena had always been aware of the discrimination that often came with her skin color. She learned early on that success didn't come easy for people like her, those who were not born into privilege or power. As a young girl, Serena faced the sting of prejudice from classmates and teachers alike, but rather than letting it defeat her, she used it as fuel to push herself harder. She graduated at the top of her class, earned scholarships, and went on to found her tech company in her late 20s. Her success had been earned every step of the way, and she carried that sense of pride and determination with her wherever she went. Yet, despite her accomplishments, Serena never forgot where she came from. She remained grounded, always using her platform to support initiatives that improved access to healthcare for marginalized communities. For her, the ultimate measure of success was the difference she could make in the lives of others. As she boarded the plane, Serena felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had worked tirelessly for the past few months to bring this new deal to fruition, and now she finally had a chance to breathe. She walked to her seat with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth, not just in terms of financial success, but in the impact she had on the world. Serena settled into her first-class seat, sinking into the plush leather chair with a sigh of contentment. The familiar hum of the plane's engines felt soothing, almost meditative, as the plane began its taxi toward the runway. She had always enjoyed flying. There was something peaceful about the way the world seemed to quiet down when you were suspended in the air. As the plane ascended, Serena gazed out the window, watching the sprawling cityscape of Los Angeles fade into the distance, replaced by a vast ocean of clouds. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, a journal where she often jotted down her thoughts and reflections. This was her time to reflect on the success of her recent business venture and the work that lay ahead. She had made a difference with this deal, she knew that much. It was only the beginning, but the potential it held to change lives was immense. Serena felt proud of the progress she had made, yet she couldn't help but think about the larger picture. There was so much more work to be done. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write, her mind drifting as she reflected on how far she had come. As the words flowed onto the page, she allowed herself to enjoy the peace and quiet of her surroundings. She could hear the soft murmurs of other passengers settling in, but it was a sound that didn't bother her. It was background noise to her thoughts. Serena's focus was on herself, on her work, on the future she was shaping. But then, as she lifted her gaze, she noticed something. A flight attendant was walking down the aisle, and her gaze seemed to linger just a little too long on Serena. There was something about the way Nicole was looking at her, an expression that Serena couldn't quite place. It was a flicker of judgment, of suspicion. Serena had seen that look before, on the faces of people who didn't quite believe she belonged in the spaces she had earned the right to be in. Serena's heart sank, but she forced herself to look away, focusing on her journal again. Not today, she thought. I've worked too hard to let this moment ruin my peace. But, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different from all the others. She would soon discover just how right she was. Nicole Adams, a 35-year-old flight attendant, had worked for Concorde Airliner for over a decade. She took great pride in her job, particularly in first class, where the standards of service were expected to be impeccable. Nicole was meticulous about everything, from the precise placement of napkins to ensuring that the finest champagne was served with a smile. Over the years, she had developed a keen sense of who belonged in first class and who didn't. It wasn't something she liked to admit, but the truth was, she often made quick judgments about the passengers, especially those who didn't match the typical profile of a first-class flyer. She had seen plenty of wealthy individuals, of course, business executives, celebrities, and dignitaries, many of whom flaunted their wealth with designer clothing and luxury accessories. But today, when she glanced down the aisle at the woman sitting quietly in first class, Nicole was surprised. Serena Robinson, a black woman dressed simply in a light gray coat and black slacks, didn't seem to fit the mold of the passengers who usually occupied this space. Her modest outfit, a stark contrast to the flashy attire of most first-class passengers, immediately caught Nicole's attention. Nicole's first instinct was to dismiss it as a mistake. After all, a woman like Serena, dressed so plainly, didn't belong in first class. There was a suspicion that gnawed at her, despite the professional face she maintained for the other passengers. As she walked down the aisle, she steeled herself. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe she's in the wrong seat, Nicole thought. But even as she reached Serena, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She must have been upgraded by mistake, she told herself, already preparing to handle the situation with what she considered her standard professionalism. When Nicole stopped in front of Serena, she gave a forced smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She paused for a moment, looking at Serena from head to toe, a subtle but unmistakable flicker of judgment crossing her face. "Excuse me, ma'am," Nicole began, her tone laced with an edge of skepticism. "I believe you're in the wrong cabin. Your seat should be in economy, not first class." Serena looked up, her calm gaze meeting Nicole's. Serena could feel the weight of the unspoken judgment in Nicole's words. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was a pointed challenge, and one Serena had dealt with countless times before. She'd been underestimated, doubted, and questioned in all manner of ways. She wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of treatment, especially from people who had yet to understand that a person's worth is not tied to the clothes they wear or the color of their skin. Serena remained composed as she reached for her ticket, her voice calm yet firm. "I'm in the right seat," she replied, handing Nicole the boarding pass. "This is my assigned seat." Nicole took the ticket from Serena's hand, inspecting it with more scrutiny than was necessary. She flipped it over, examining the details as if expecting to find some discrepancy, some reason to justify her assumption that Serena didn't belong in first class. Her brow furrowed and she looked back at Serena, a silent question lingering in her gaze. Her lips thinned, her professional smile now replaced with an expression of quiet disbelief. The seconds stretched on, the tension in the air growing palpable. Passengers nearby began to notice the confrontation, their curious eyes darting back and forth between the two women. Some pretended to read their books or look out the windows, but others couldn't help but watch the interaction unfold. Serena could feel their eyes on her, but she refused to let the discomfort show. She had dealt with this before, and she wasn't about to let it rattle her. Nicole finally returned the ticket to Serena, her face a mix of frustration and barely concealed disdain. "Well, it seems everything is in order," she said, her voice colder now. "But I'm not sure this seat suits you." Her words were thinly veiled with a passive-aggressive tone, laced with an insult that Serena could not ignore. Serena's grip tightened on the armrest, but her expression remained unchanged. She wasn't just a passenger here, she was a person deserving of dignity and respect. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. "This is my seat, and I'll be staying here." There was no hesitation in her voice, only quiet but unyielding resolve. She knew she had every right to be here, regardless of Nicole's skepticism. Nicole's eyes flickered briefly, but she quickly masked her discomfort with a stiff posture. She couldn't quite believe that Serena wasn't apologizing or offering an excuse. For someone like Nicole, this was a moment of challenge, one that didn't sit well with her sense of authority. Passengers who had once been just a blur of faces in the background now felt closer, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, still processing the defiance in Serena's words. Her mind raced. She had never encountered a passenger who didn't immediately comply. This woman, with her quiet dignity, was not acting how Nicole expected. But it wasn't just the behavior that bothered Nicole. There was something about Serena that made her uncomfortable. A subtle but powerful reminder of the biases Nicole hadn't fully confronted. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, getting this issue resolved. "I'll need to speak with the pilot," Nicole said, her voice clipped. She turned away from Serena, the disdain still lingering in her eyes. She wasn't used to challenges, especially ones that went against the assumptions she'd held for so long. But Serena's unwavering calm had caught her off guard. As Nicole walked toward the cockpit, Serena's gaze followed her, a quiet storm brewing in her chest. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about standing her ground in the face of prejudice. Serena knew that this wouldn't be the last time she would have to face it, but today she would not let it break her, not now, not ever. Serena sat quietly, the weight of Nicole's scrutiny pressing heavily on her chest. She had always prided herself on staying calm in the face of injustice, on remaining composed and dignified even when others tried to diminish her. But this time, something felt different. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or an innocent mistake. No, this was about something deeper. A bias that had been ingrained in society for far too long, something she had encountered time and time again, but never without the sting of its sharp edges. She could feel the hot flush of anger rising in her chest, the burning sensation of being judged simply because of the color of her skin and the clothes she wore. It was a feeling she knew all too well, one that had followed her through childhood and into adulthood. It was the feeling she had experienced when she was the only black student in her class and when she had been passed over for promotions despite outperforming her colleagues. And it was the feeling of having doors slammed in her face, of being treated as less than, simply because others couldn't see beyond their own biases. But even as the anger simmered, Serena fought to maintain control. Not today, she thought. Not this time. She had worked too hard for this moment, too hard to build her life and her career, to let someone like Nicole take it from her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Hold your head high and let your success speak for you." Serena took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She couldn't let herself react in anger. This wasn't the way to win, but deep inside, she felt the hurt and frustration building up, threatening to burst out. Serena's mind drifted back to her childhood, back to the times when she had been the target of blatant racism. She remembered the sting of being called names, the whispers that followed her as she walked down the hallway at school. She had been told time and time again that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong. And yet, here she was, a successful businesswoman, a powerful force in her industry, and still she faced the same old prejudices. She shook her head, trying to dispel the painful memories. "I've come too far to let this destroy me," she reminded herself. She wasn't that scared little girl anymore. She wasn't going to let a flight attendant define her worth. Serena was stronger now, and she knew that her worth wasn't defined by anyone's perceptions of her. She had earned her place in this world, and no one, certainly not Nicole, was going to take that away from her. Nicole returned to Serena, still holding the ticket in her hand. She had scrutinized it for so long that it felt as though she were looking for a mistake that didn't exist. The words on the ticket were clear, printed in bold letters, "First class." But despite this, Nicole continued to glance at Serena as though she expected something to change, some sign that this was all a mistake. Her eyebrows furrowed in concentration, as if the ticket itself was somehow flawed. The other passengers were beginning to take notice. Some had already stopped pretending to read their magazines or look out the windows, their eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. Serena could feel their gazes, each one a silent witness to her mistreatment. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke up. It was as though they were waiting for someone else to take charge, to say something. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence that had fallen over the cabin seemed to heighten it. Serena, however, didn't look away. She met the eyes of the passengers who watched her, holding their gazes with a steady, unwavering determination. She wasn't going to be the one to cower, to let this moment pass without making her stance clear. She had fought for too long to be treated as less than, and this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant moment, was one more battle she would not lose. Nicole finally sighed, returning the ticket to Serena. The thin smile that had once been on her face had long since disappeared, replaced with a look of quiet discontent. "It seems everything's in order," Nicole said. Her voice clipped, as if Serena's very presence was an inconvenience she couldn't escape. "But I'm afraid you're still in the wrong seat." The words felt like a slap across the face, even without the physical impact. Serena stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. "Excuse me," Serena said, her voice calm but firm. "This is my seat. I'm not going anywhere." There was no hesitation in her words. She wasn't about to make excuses, wasn't about to apologize for existing in a space that she had every right to occupy. Nicole opened her mouth to respond, but Serena was already speaking again. "If you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with the pilot. But I will not be treated like I don't belong here." The words came out in a controlled rush, each one carefully chosen, but full of the weight of years of experience. Years of standing up for herself, of fighting to be seen, of demanding the respect she deserved. Nicole faltered for a moment. Her eyes flickered with disbelief, and then just as quickly a flash of defiance crossed her face. She wasn't used to passengers standing up to her, especially not in first class. Serena's words had shifted something, just a little, inside the flight attendant, but Nicole wasn't ready to back down just yet. "I'll be calling the pilot," she said, her voice a little harsher now. She turned on her heel and walked toward the cockpit, leaving Serena standing there, her back straight, her posture unyielding. The passengers continued to watch, some of them holding their breath, others visibly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak out. Serena felt the weight of their silence, but she also felt a sense of pride in her stance. She had done what needed to be done. She had stood up for herself, despite the injustice that had been handed to her. As Nicole reached the cockpit, Serena sat back down. She didn't look around at the other passengers. She didn't need their approval. She had taken control of the situation, and that was all that mattered. Captain Richard Matthews had been in the air long enough to know how to handle all kinds of passengers. At 50 years old, with more than 20 years of experience as a pilot, Matthews had become accustomed to managing everything from turbulent skies to difficult passengers. His presence was commanding, his demeanor calm yet firm, and his ability to take control of any situation was a trait that had earned him the respect of his colleagues. But beneath that exterior of professionalism, there was a certain arrogance, an unwavering belief that his experience and position made him infallible. As he entered the first-class cabin, Matthews could sense the tension that hung in the air. Nicole, the flight attendant, was standing near Serena with an expression that suggested something was wrong. He didn't bother asking what had happened, assuming that whatever issue had arisen could be quickly sorted out. After all, he was the captain, and his authority was never questioned. Nicole wasted no time explaining the situation. She had already made her judgment about Serena and was convinced that this was simply an error. "She's causing a disturbance," Nicole told Matthews in a low voice. "She's in the wrong seat. I've checked her ticket, but I think she must have been upgraded by mistake." Matthews nodded briefly, still not giving the situation a second thought. His eyes flicked towards Serena, and the moment they landed on her, he immediately made up his mind. This was a woman who didn't belong in first class. Someone who looked out of place with her simple attire and calm demeanor. It was obvious to him that Serena didn't fit the image of a typical first-class passenger, and in his mind, she was already guilty of disrupting the flight. Without even asking Serena for her side of the story, Matthews approached her with the kind of steely confidence that only someone with decades of experience could wield. He looked down at her, his eyes cold, offering no sympathy or understanding. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" His voice was clipped, his tone dismissive. The words weren't a question, they were a challenge. Serena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Matthews to be so quick to side with Nicole, but it wasn't surprising. She had been in this situation before, too many times to count. She'd faced the judgment, the assumptions, and the silent prejudice that came with her skin color. She had grown accustomed to people like Matthews, people who didn't need to ask for an explanation because they had already decided who deserved respect and who didn't. "I'm in the right seat," Serena said calmly, her voice unwavering. "I have a valid ticket for this seat, and I'm not moving." Matthews didn't even blink. He didn't pause to consider her words. Instead, he simply looked at her with a furrowed brow, clearly irritated. "You're disturbing the other passengers," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "If you don't comply, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." Serena stood her ground, her posture straight, her gaze unflinching. "I'm not disturbing anyone," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm simply sitting in the seat that I paid for, and I'm not going anywhere." The air between them crackled with tension, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Serena could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their gazes shifting uncomfortably between her and Matthews. Some of them were probably hoping the confrontation would end quickly, others likely unsure of what was happening. But in that moment, Serena knew she had to be strong. She wasn't just fighting for her seat on the plane, she was fighting for her dignity, her right to exist in a space that people like Matthews and Nicole thought she didn't deserve. Matthews, unable to maintain control in the face of her defiance, took a step closer. He didn't want to hear Serena's explanation. He didn't care about her ticket or the fact that she was right. All he saw was a woman who didn't belong in first class, and that simple fact infuriated him. His anger bubbled to the surface, and in one swift motion, he raised his hand and slapped Serena across the face. The sound of the slap was deafening, echoing through the cabin like a thunderclap. Serena's cheek stung, the pain sharp and sudden. She blinked, her body momentarily frozen in disbelief. But it wasn't just the physical pain that hit her. It was the humiliation. The shock of being struck in front of a cabin full of passengers. She felt the weight of it, the sting of prejudice, of being made to feel like she didn't belong. The slap wasn't just an act of violence. It was a message that Serena was less than. The cabin fell into an eerie silence. The passengers were stunned, some too shocked to even process what had just happened. Serena's heart pounded in her chest, her breath quick and shallow. For a moment, she was overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what had just occurred. She had faced prejudice and disrespect before, but this was a line that had been crossed. But then something shifted inside her. The shock began to fade, replaced by a burning, righteous anger. She had been slapped, publicly humiliated, but she wasn't going to let Matthews or anyone else define her worth. She wasn't going to let this moment break her. Slowly, Serena reached up and touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of the mark left by Matthew's slap. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve only grew stronger. She looked up at Matthews, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that held no fear, only defiance. This is not the end, she thought. This is just the beginning. Serena stood tall, her voice cutting through the silence. "If you think that's going to make me leave, you're mistaken," she said, her tone low but filled with steel. "You've just crossed a line, Captain, and I won't back down." The slap had been intended to silence her, to remind her of her place, but it had done the opposite. It had ignited something inside her, a fire that would not be put out. Serena wasn't going to leave quietly. She wasn't going to let this injustice slide. And she wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now, not ever. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. The slap had been so sudden, so jarring that even the sound of Serena's breath felt loud in the stillness. For a moment she was frozen in place, the sting of the slap still ringing in her mind, a physical reminder of the cruelty that people like Matthews were capable of. But despite the physical pain, what hurt most was the humiliation. Her mind raced as she processed what had just happened. She had been publicly humiliated in front of an entire cabin of strangers. She had been slapped like a child, told in no uncertain terms that she didn't belong, that her presence in first class was an affront to someone else's idea of who deserved respect. Serena held her cheek, her fingers lightly pressing against the red mark left by Matthew's hand. The heat from the slap seemed to radiate from her skin, and for a moment she thought she might break. But then, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a woman who had been slapped. She was a force to be reckoned with, a successful entrepreneur, a leader in her industry, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to get where she was. Serena knew deep in her heart that this moment would not define her. She had spent too long fighting for her place in the world to let a man like Matthews take it away in a single unjust moment. As she walked out of the first-class cabin, her steps slow but deliberate, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some filled with sympathy, others filled with uncertainty. But it didn't matter. Their gazes, whether filled with judgment or empathy, didn't change the fact that she had been wronged. It didn't change the fact that she was walking away with her dignity intact, even if it had been bruised. The pain from the slap would fade, but the injustice would not. And that was when the realization hit her. This was bigger than just her. This wasn't just about one woman's dignity. This was about a culture of discrimination that people like Matthews had perpetuated for far too long. She had faced prejudice and unfair treatment before, but this moment, this act of violence, was different. It wasn't just about her personal pain. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced, belittled, or dismissed because of who they were. As Serena made her way down the narrow aisle, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Every step she took was deliberate, her mind racing as she walked toward the back of the plane. What just happened, she thought. How could this man, a representative of authority, treat me this way? She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of anger and disbelief filling her, but in the midst of the chaos that swirled within her, she realized something profound. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wouldn't let Matthews or anyone else dictate her future based on their biases. She walked toward the back of the plane, knowing she needed to act. As an entrepreneur, she had always fought for fairness and equality in her business dealings, but this felt different. This wasn't a boardroom fight over market share or innovation. It was a battle for justice, for dignity, for respect. And she wasn't going to lose. In that moment, a fierce resolve settled in Serena's chest. This is not the end, she promised herself. This is only the beginning. She knew that she couldn't let the shame of the slap linger. Instead of reacting out of anger, she would channel her hurt into something more powerful. She would fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been subjected to this kind of treatment. She had the resources, the influence, and the drive to make a change. This wasn't just about her right to be treated with respect on this flight. It was about the systemic injustices that needed to be dismantled. She had worked tirelessly to build her career, to break barriers, and to fight for people like her, and this moment was no different. Serena wasn't going to be a passive victim in this story. She was going to take action. Her mind raced with possibilities. She could start with the airline, demand accountability, force a public reckoning, but it wouldn't stop there. She would use her voice, her platform, to raise awareness about the pervasive nature of discrimination in all areas of life, especially in places where people thought their power and privilege protected them. Serena would not let Matthews' actions go unchallenged. She would make sure that this moment, this injustice, sparked something bigger than herself. She took one final look at the first-class cabin before she exited the plane, her back straight, her head held high. "I will not let this break me," she told herself. "I will make sure this never happens again to anyone." And as the plane's doors closed behind her, Serena made a vow. She would take this fight beyond the confines of the flight. This was only the beginning of her journey toward justice. Serena wasted no time. The moment she stepped off the plane, her mind shifted into high gear. This was no longer just a moment of personal humiliation. It had become a pivotal point in her life, one that would push her to use everything at her disposal to create real change. She immediately contacted her legal team, instructing them to begin an immediate investigation into the actions of Nicole Adams and Captain Richard Matthews. Serena wasn't interested in simply filing a complaint or receiving a token apology. She needed to ensure that the airline faced the full consequences of its employees' behavior. The phone call was succinct but purposeful. Serena's legal team knew her well enough to understand the gravity of the situation. They were instructed to gather evidence, including testimonies from passengers who had witnessed the altercation, and to ensure that no detail went overlooked. Serena was prepared for a fight, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence her. This wasn't just about her dignity anymore. It was about holding the airline accountable for the culture of discrimination that clearly still existed within its ranks. But Serena wasn't going to stop there. She was strategic, always thinking ahead. She knew that addressing the behavior of Nicole and Matthews was important, but it was just the first step. Serena began to lay out her long-term plan for creating lasting, systemic change within the airline industry, using her influence as a powerful businesswoman and her platform as a leading advocate for diversity and inclusion. She reached out to her contacts, leveraging her connections to media outlets and advocacy groups. Serena knew that her story, when told through the lens of her position in the business world, could shine a spotlight on the issue in a way that would make it impossible to ignore. She wasn't just a victim of discrimination. She was a powerful voice calling for change. She would use the media to hold the airline's leadership accountable for not addressing these issues earlier, for allowing a culture of bias to fester without consequence. As she worked with her legal team, Serena began to map out a series of reforms she would demand from the airline. She wasn't interested in half measures. She wanted comprehensive changes, starting with mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, from the flight attendants to the pilots and management. She would also push for a revamped complaint system, one that ensured passengers of color and other marginalized groups would have their complaints taken seriously and addressed promptly. Serena's investigation into the airline's practices quickly uncovered something that sent a chill down her spine. As the legal team began gathering testimonies, they discovered that the behavior exhibited by Nicole and Matthews was not an isolated incident. It was part of a long-standing pattern of discrimination that had been systematically ignored by the airline for years. Numerous passengers of color had filed complaints about unfair treatment, mistreatment, and outright prejudice while flying with the airline. These complaints had been buried or dismissed, often with no more than a generic apology or no response at all. Serena's legal team uncovered a disturbing history of biased treatment. Black passengers who were unjustly questioned about their seating assignments, Latino passengers who were treated with overt hostility, and other passengers of marginalized identities who had experienced everything from rude comments to complete neglect. The more Serena learned, the angrier she became. It was clear to her now that this wasn't just a random incident involving two rogue employees. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue. An issue of systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester within the airline for years. This wasn't just about Nicole and Matthews. This was about an entire organization that had failed to address the biases inherent in its culture. The airline had turned a blind eye to complaints, allowing discriminatory behavior to become a silent norm. Serena's resolve strengthened as she read through the testimonies. One in particular stood out to her. A passenger who had been moved from first class to economy without explanation, only to overhear a flight attendant comment that someone like her shouldn't be in first class. The phrase was so casual, so dismissive, and it highlighted the very real, insidious prejudices that were entrenched in the airline's culture. This wasn't a mistake, this was a pattern that had been ignored, swept under the rug, and allowed to perpetuate for years. This discovery fueled Serena's determination. She realized that this wasn't just about confronting one incident, it was about confronting the entire system. This airline has a much bigger problem than Nicole and Matthews, she thought. This is about addressing a culture of discrimination that's been allowed to continue unchecked. Serena made a decision then and there. This would be bigger than her personal fight. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than a full overhaul of the airline's practices. This wasn't just about justice for her. It was about ensuring that future passengers, especially those who had faced the same treatment she had, would be treated with dignity and respect. She would use her platform and resources to ensure that this change reached beyond the walls of the airline. The fight had become something larger than Serena's own experience. It was now a movement, a fight against the systemic racism and discrimination that too many people, especially people of color, had faced in silence. Serena wasn't just seeking justice for herself anymore. She was leading the charge for an industry-wide reckoning. And this was just the beginning. Serena's investigation had uncovered the deep roots of the issue, and she wasn't about to let it stop there. It became clear to her that this wasn't just an isolated incident of discrimination. It was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed head-on. To ensure the airline faced real consequences, Serena pushed for a thorough audit of all past customer complaints, not just the ones related to her case. She demanded that the airline open its records, allowing her legal team full access to any documents that could reveal similar patterns of bias and mistreatment. She wasn't asking for a small investigation. She was insisting on a comprehensive review that would leave no stone unturned. Serena's legal team worked around the clock to gather evidence, interviewing passengers who had filed complaints in the past and collecting testimonies from former employees who had witnessed or experienced discriminatory practices firsthand. She made it clear that this wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that the airline's actions aligned with its public image and that its internal culture shifted to one of true inclusivity and respect. The audit began, and it didn't take long for more troubling patterns to surface. Serena ensured that the airline didn't simply treat her case as a one-off issue that could be resolved with a few apologies. Instead, she pushed for systemic changes that would ripple through every level of the company, from the flight attendants to the executives. She demanded that the airline's leadership be held accountable for allowing a culture of discrimination to take root and persist for so long. But Serena wasn't content with internal investigations alone. She knew that public accountability would drive real change. She needed to ensure that the rest of the world knew about the airline's failure to address its biases. She knew that if this was going to be the catalyst for a larger movement, the public needed to see how deep the problem ran. Serena decided it was time to take the fight beyond the confines of the legal system and the airline's boardrooms. She understood the power of the press, how public opinion could force institutions to act when internal pressure alone wasn't enough. After much consideration, she strategically leaked information about the airline's failure to adequately address systemic discrimination to several key media outlets. The story made its way into major newspapers and online platforms, with headlines calling attention to the airline's long-standing issue with discrimination and the violent altercation she had suffered at the hands of Captain Matthews and flight attendant Nicole Adams. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupted with passengers, advocates, and organizations speaking out in support of Serena and demanding justice. The public outcry was deafening. As the story spread, the airline began to feel the weight of its actions. The pressure mounted, and the company's leadership could no longer ignore the demands for accountability. The airline's reputation, once synonymous with luxury and quality, was now tarnished. Serena knew that this was exactly what needed to happen. She wasn't just fighting for personal justice anymore, she was turning her painful experience into a powerful weapon for systemic reform. By making the story public, she ensured that the airline had no choice but to take swift and decisive action. They could no longer dismiss her demands as the rantings of a disgruntled passenger. The weight of public opinion would push them to take real action, and Serena wasn't about to let them off the hook. As the pressure mounted, the airline's leadership began to respond. They issued a public apology, acknowledging the mistakes made by Nicole and Matthews, but Serena knew it wasn't enough. She wasn't asking for empty words, she was asking for real, meaningful change. The media coverage forced the airline to confront the reality of its discriminatory practices, and with it the beginning of a public reckoning that would force them to reevaluate their internal policies and employee training. Serena stood firm, knowing that the battle was far from over, but with the power of the press behind her, she had made her voice impossible to ignore. This was only the beginning of her fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. Nicole stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tight collar of the mandatory training uniform they had provided for her. The bright fluorescent lights of the training room made her feel exposed, almost as though she were under the scrutiny of an invisible jury. The room was filled with employees from all levels of the airline: flight attendants, ground staff, pilots, and management. They all sat in silence, their faces etched with discomfort. This wasn't just any training session. It was the beginning of a much-needed reckoning, one that had been long overdue. And Nicole was here, not because she wanted to be, but because she had no choice. Her stomach churned with a mixture of shame and guilt as she sat down, her eyes darting around the room. She had never thought much about the deeper implications of her behavior. Sure, she knew that she had been a little quick to judge Serena when she first encountered her, but she had never imagined it would escalate into something like this. Never thought that her biases she had assumed were harmless or even justifiable, could lead to someone being publicly humiliated. It wasn't until she saw the videos, read the stories, and heard the accounts from other passengers that the gravity of her actions truly hit her. Nicole had been so sure of herself, convinced that her actions were justified, that Serena was out of place, that she wasn't meant to be in first class. But now, as she sat in this room, listening to stories of discrimination and bias, she realized how wrong she had been. The training wasn't just about how to deal with passengers better, it was about facing the uncomfortable truths she had avoided. As she listened to the testimonies of passengers who had been unfairly treated, including people of color, Nicole's thoughts swirled. It wasn't just about this one encounter. It was about the countless small ways her biases had impacted the experiences of those around her. The dismissive glance, the raised eyebrow, the assumptions she had made about people based on how they looked or how they spoke, it was all part of a pattern. The facilitator spoke, encouraging everyone to reflect on their experiences and biases, to acknowledge the harm they had done and to begin making amends. As the session continued, Nicole began to feel the weight of it all. Every word from the trainer resonated deeply. She began to see how her actions were not just small mistakes. They were part of a larger, harmful system that perpetuated inequality. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much damage she had caused, not just to Serena, but to others who had been subject to her subconscious prejudice. By the time the training ended, Nicole's mindset had shifted. She wasn't the same person she had been when she walked in. There was genuine remorse in her heart, and she knew that it was time to make things right. She couldn't undo the damage, but she could take responsibility for it, and the first step was reaching out to Serena. Nicole composed an email to Serena, her hands trembling as she typed. She expressed her regret for her actions, acknowledging the hurt she had caused. She admitted that, at the time, she had made assumptions based on Serena's appearance, and that she was deeply sorry for the way she treated her. She asked for forgiveness, not as an attempt to erase the past, but as a way to begin the process of reconciliation. Nicole knew that her apology couldn't undo the harm, but it was a start, a small but important step toward becoming a better person and a better representative of the airline. Captain Matthews sat in his office, his hands folded in front of him, staring blankly at the paperwork on his desk. The incident had been months ago, but the impact of it still lingered. He had been a pilot for over 20 years, and in all his time in the air, he had never felt such shame. The slap he had delivered to Serena had been out of line, of course, but that wasn't what bothered him most. What bothered him was the deep realization that he hadn't even questioned his actions. He hadn't considered that Serena might have been in the right, that his knee-jerk assumption about her based on her appearance was the problem. Matthews had always prided himself on being a man of control. He had a reputation in the airline for keeping things orderly, for handling difficult situations with calm precision. But in that moment, when Serena stood her ground and refused to be intimidated, he had lost control, and the consequences were devastating, not just for her, but for him as well. His actions had been reckless, and they had cost him more than his position as a pilot. They had cost him his integrity. As Matthews sat alone in his office, the training materials from the Cultural Awareness program lay on the desk in front of him. He had been forced to participate in the sessions, just like the rest of the staff. At first, he had felt resentful. He didn't need to be told how to treat people. He had always considered himself a professional, always prided himself on maintaining authority in the cabin. But now, after months of reflection, the lessons from the training had started to sink in. Matthews had learned that authority wasn't about control or dominance, it was about respect. And respect wasn't something that could be dictated by rank or uniform. Respect was earned by understanding, by acknowledging the experiences of others, by recognizing the ways in which biases could infiltrate even the most well-meaning actions. One of the sessions had focused on the concept of unconscious bias, and Matthews had been forced to confront his own prejudices in ways he hadn't anticipated. He remembered the moment the trainer asked everyone to think about their past actions, to reflect on how their biases had shaped their interactions. Matthews had thought about Serena. He remembered the way she had stood her ground, her calm yet defiant manner, and how he had slapped her without a second thought. It had been a reaction based not on fact or reason, but on his own preconceived notions. That realization hit him harder than any of the training exercises. The pain he had caused Serena and the realization that he had perpetuated a culture of discrimination made him feel sick to his stomach. Matthews had always seen himself as a protector, as someone who kept order in the skies, but in that moment, he had been the one causing disorder, the one making the situation worse. With a heavy heart, Matthews made the decision to reach out to Serena. He knew she had every right to be angry, and he knew that no apology would undo the harm he had caused. But he needed to acknowledge what he had done. He needed to own his actions, to express his regret not just for slapping her, but for the way he had allowed his biases to guide his behavior. He picked up the phone and dialed Serena's number, taking a deep breath before pressing it to his ear. As it rang, Matthews braced himself for whatever response he might receive. He knew that his apology might not be accepted, but it was a step in the right direction. When Serena answered, Matthews spoke from the heart, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry, Serena. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know that I deeply regret what I did. I was wrong, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. The way I treated you wasn't right, and I'll spend the rest of my career working to make sure something like that never happens again." There was a long pause on the line, but when Serena spoke, her voice was calm, measured. "Thank you for your apology, Captain Matthews. It's a start, but actions speak louder than words. You have the power to change things. I hope you take that responsibility seriously." Matthews nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I will," he promised. "I'll do better." Serena sat alone in her office, the soft hum of her computer the only sound that filled the quiet space. Her phone lay on the desk in front of her, still warm from the call she had just had with Captain Matthews. The apology had been sincere, and she could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. It had taken courage for him to reach out to her, to admit the mistakes he had made. Similarly, Nicole's apology had been heartfelt too, though the weight of the past few months made it difficult for Serena to fully embrace either of them. It was easy to forgive when the wounds were still fresh, but forgiveness wasn't something Serena had ever taken lightly. As she sat there, reflecting on the words Matthews and Nicole had said to her, she felt conflicted. On one hand, their apologies were a step in the right direction. They had acknowledged their actions, their wrongdoings, and committed to change. But Serena knew that it couldn't stop there. She wasn't fighting for personal closure. Her goal had never been about punishing individuals for their wrongdoings. It was about creating lasting, institutional change. Serena had grown past the need for personal justice. Her mission, which had started as a fight for respect on a plane, had evolved into a movement, one that sought to reshape an entire system, an entire industry. Serena thought back to the first moment she had stepped onto that flight, how she had simply wanted a peaceful, quiet experience, only to have it shattered by the biases of others. That moment, as painful as it was, had awakened something within her, a desire not just to be heard, but to be understood, to ensure that others would never have to face the same indignity. But this journey wasn't just about her personal pain. It was about everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated because of their race, gender, or any other factor that society had deemed as other. The airline was just one piece of the puzzle. Serena's larger vision had always been to transform the world around her, to build a future where people were judged based on their character, not their appearance. The path she had set out on was long, and it was going to require much more than apologies. It would require systemic reforms, educational initiatives, and a complete overhaul of how industries treated those who had long been marginalized. The fight was far from over. Serena stood in front of her mirror, taking a deep breath as she gathered her thoughts. The apologies from Nicole and Matthews were significant, but she knew that it was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. The internal investigation had barely begun, and the public outcry was only starting to build. She had started a fire with her public stance, and now it was time to stoke those flames into something that could change the world. The work ahead of her was enormous. Serena had already begun drafting her plan for reform, not just within the airline but within the broader industry. She wanted to start with education, mandatory sensitivity and cultural awareness training for all airline employees, not just for flight attendants, but for pilots, ground staff, and management. She knew this would be a monumental task, one that would face resistance at every level, but Serena was undeterred. The backlash that was sure to come didn't scare her. It only fueled her determination. She had always believed that true power didn't come from revenge or retribution. It came from resilience, the ability to rise again after being knocked down, the strength to push forward even when the odds were stacked against you. Serena knew that her resilience was her greatest weapon. The airline's leadership had been forced to respond to her actions, but now she would make sure that they couldn't ignore the systemic issues that had allowed discrimination to continue unchecked for so long. It was time to move forward, to take the next step in her journey. Nicole and Matthews had started the process of change within themselves, but the real work was still ahead. Serena wasn't just going to be a passive bystander in this fight. She was going to be the one leading it. The industry had become her battleground, but more than that, it was her mission to create a space where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or identity, could feel seen and respected. The path would be difficult, but Serena was ready. She had endured too much to turn back now. She had started a revolution in her own right, and this was just the beginning. With renewed determination, Serena picked up the phone. She was about to make calls that would ensure the changes she wanted to see were implemented, not just within the airline, but across the entire aviation industry. And she knew she would not stop until real change had been achieved. Serena's work was far from over, but the first steps toward real change were being made. Her legal team, now fully engaged in the process, had successfully pushed the airline's leadership to the table, forcing them to confront their deep-seated issues with discrimination. The pressure from the public and the media, combined with her unwavering determination, had set the stage for comprehensive reform. Serena had a clear vision for the airline's future, one that would prioritize fairness, respect, and inclusion in every aspect of its operations. The first part of her plan involved implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity and anti-discrimination training for all employees. She worked closely with industry experts and consultants to develop a training program that would address unconscious bias, racial and cultural stereotypes, and the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The program was designed not as a one-off event, but as an ongoing educational process. Every employee, from the flight attendants to the pilots to the managers and ground staff, was required to undergo the training regularly. Serena knew that without proper accountability, these changes would be nothing more than empty gestures. To ensure that the new training had a lasting impact, she pushed for the creation of a more robust customer complaint system. The previous complaint mechanism had been ineffective, with passengers of color and marginalized groups often feeling ignored or dismissed. Serena demanded a complete overhaul. The new system was designed to make it easier for passengers to file complaints, track the progress of their cases, and ensure that every issue was addressed with transparency and urgency. Additionally, she introduced a new system of employee performance reviews, one that placed a strong emphasis on how employees treated passengers. She worked with HR to develop a set of criteria that would measure not just the technical abilities of staff, but also their emotional intelligence and cultural competence. The idea was simple. Every employee's success should be judged not only by their ability to do their job, but by their ability to make passengers feel respected and valued. While these reforms were crucial, Serena knew that real change had to be woven into the fabric of the company's culture. It wasn't enough to mandate training sessions or create new systems. The airline's leadership had to adopt a new mindset, one that placed inclusivity at the heart of its mission. Serena worked tirelessly to ensure that inclusivity became a core value of the airline, deeply embedded in its policies, its hiring practices, and its day-to-day operations. Serena's influence began to spread beyond the confines of the airline. As the company began to shift in its treatment of passengers, Serena's leadership was recognized by industry leaders and advocates alike. Other airlines and companies began to take note of the changes that were taking place at the airline. They began reaching out to Serena for advice on how to implement similar reforms in their own organizations. Over the next several months, the changes within the airline began to take root. Passengers who had once felt uncomfortable or disrespected now felt heard and valued. The complaints that had once been ignored were being addressed, and employees began to treat customers with a newfound respect. The first-class cabin, once a space of exclusion and judgment, became a place where people of all backgrounds were welcomed. Even the airline's flight attendants and pilots began to feel the shift, with many of them reporting that the training had not only made them more aware of their biases, but had also improved their work environment. As Serena's efforts gained recognition, her influence continued to grow. The changes she had fought for became the foundation for a new era in the airline industry. Serena's leadership and commitment to social justice made her a sought-eager figure, invited to speak at conferences, to consult with other companies, and to advise government bodies on diversity and inclusion. Her story of resilience in the face of adversity became a beacon of hope for others who were fighting for justice in their own industries. The airline itself became a model of inclusivity and fairness. Other companies, particularly in the travel and hospitality industries, began to follow its lead, adopting similar policies and practices to address discrimination and bias within their own ranks. What started as one woman's fight for respect on a plane had evolved into a movement that was changing industries, workplaces, and lives. For Serena, the work was still ongoing, but the transformation was already clear. She had created a lasting impact, not just for herself, but for countless others who would never have to face the same kind of discrimination that she did. She had made a difference, and the ripple effect of that difference was spreading far beyond what she had ever imagined. Serena's story was no longer just about a moment of personal pain. It was a legacy of change, one that would inspire generations to come. As Serena looked out at the horizon, her heart swelled with pride. This was what she had worked for. This was the change she had fought for. And as she stood on the precipice of an even larger movement, she knew that the best was yet to come. Serena stood by her office window, looking out at the city below. The world outside seemed vast, yet at this moment it felt smaller, more connected than ever before. Her mind replayed the events of the past months, the conflict on the plane, the pain of the slap, the long, difficult journey toward justice. She had fought, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced by prejudice and bias. She had turned her personal experience into a movement that had grown far beyond her initial expectations. The world had been watching, and through her actions, Serena had shown that change was possible. even in the face of systemic injustice. But as she reflected on the journey she had been through, Serena couldn't help but think of how much further there was to go. This fight, she realized, wasn't just about one airline, one industry, or one moment of injustice. It was about a broader, more far-reaching change, a movement to reshape entire systems and challenge the cultural norms that allowed discrimination to thrive. And though Serena had made incredible strides, the battle was ongoing. The true work had only just begun. What struck her most in these moments of reflection was the immense power of standing up for what's right. She hadn't always known where this journey would lead, but she had trusted her instinct to push forward. The people who had doubted her, the ones who had questioned her place in first class, they had underestimated her, and they had underestimated the power of determination. Serena had proven that one voice, one action, could ripple outward and create monumental change. The path to true justice was never easy, but it was always worth pursuing. Yet as she looked at how much she had accomplished, Serena also understood that her personal growth, her own transformation from a woman who had been wronged to a leader who fought for change, was only a small part of the broader movement. This wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had felt the sting of injustice, and about creating a world where no one had to endure what she had. The shift she had initiated was just the beginning. There was still so much to do. Serena's story is a powerful testament to the impact one person can have, but it also raises an important question. What would you do if you were Serena? If you witnessed an injustice, whether in the workplace, in your community, or even in the world, would you have the courage to stand up and speak out? Would you be willing to challenge the status quo, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against you? Serena didn't just sit back and let things unfold. She didn't let the personal hurt she experienced turn into bitterness. Instead, she used it as fuel to ignite a larger fire for change. Her fight continues to resonate with so many who have found themselves in situations where they too felt the weight of discrimination and prejudice. Her story encourages others to ask themselves, how far would you go to challenge systemic injustice? The road ahead is long, and Serena knows that real, lasting change doesn't happen overnight, but she also knows that when enough people stand together, when enough voices rise in unison, change becomes inevitable. She has shown that one person's voice can start a wave, and that wave can build into something that changes the world. So the call to action is clear. Stand up, speak out. Don't let silence be the answer to injustice. Just as Serena fought for fairness and respect, so too can we. Each of us has the power to make a difference, to challenge what's wrong, and to demand a future where fairness, equality, and respect are not just ideals, but lived realities. Serena's fight is far from over, but it is a fight we can all take part in. The time to act is now. Serena's journey had started as a personal struggle, but it had blossomed into something much larger, a quiet revolution that transcended the boundaries of the airline industry. What began as one woman's refusal to accept injustice had grown into a movement that challenged deeply ingrained biases, confronted systemic discrimination, and created ripples of change that reached far beyond the confines of a single airplane cabin. Her legacy was not just one of personal triumph, but of transformation, a proof that individuals, no matter their background or circumstances, had the power to reshape the systems around them. Serena's actions demonstrated that even in the face of adversity, standing up for what's right could ignite widespread change. She had taken control of her life, using the injustices she faced as the catalyst for reform that would impact countless others. The changes that Serena fought for in the airline were just the beginning. She had shown that it wasn't enough to challenge the individual wrongdoers. The real battle was against the systems that enabled those wrongdoings to persist. By pushing for policies that addressed not just individual behavior but systemic issues, Serena had created a blueprint for how change could be achieved on a larger scale. Her insistence on cultural sensitivity training, new complaint systems, and accountability measures served as a reminder that true justice wasn't just about punishing those who wronged you. It was about creating an environment where discrimination could never take root again. Her story also served as a powerful call to others who had faced similar struggles. It was proof that no one had to accept injustice as the status quo. Serena had started with a single act of defiance, and that act had spiraled into a movement that was changing industries, mindsets, and lives. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but Serena's persistence had proven that lasting change was possible, one step at a time, one person at a time. But Serena's work was far from finished. As she looked at the changes within the airline, she knew that the transformation she had begun must continue. Her legacy wasn't just about the reforms she had implemented, it was about inspiring others to take action in their own lives. She had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up for dignity and fairness, and now it was up to others to continue her work. Now we turn the question to you. How would you have reacted in Serena's position? What steps can we take, individually and collectively, to ensure that discrimination never happens again? What does true justice look like in these situations? Serena's story encourages us all to take action when we see injustice. It reminds us that we don't have to wait for someone else to create change. We have the power to challenge the systems around us and stand up for what's right, whether in our workplaces, communities, or even in small everyday interactions. We can all make a difference. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected.